All right, let's get going with part two. I originally had already done this, but I had a technical difficulty, and for some reason it wouldn't upload. But let's go ahead and get started on part two as far as talking about the historical context of criminology. Last time we talked, we left off with the idea of the Salem witch trials and really what caused it. So what I want to kind of do is spend just a minute or two going over, was it demonic possession or was it something else that was really going on? So two of the more popular ideas about that outside of the demonic possession possibility was actually this idea of political and social strains. And what we had there was similar to, like, we talked about the witchcraft in England, how they handled it. Um, that was essentially what could have been happening here in Salem. There were two different areas of Salem, which would have been Old Town and New Town. Old Town was more so for uh, the poorer individuals, those who had more difficulties, whereas Newtown tended to be wealthier. So what we ran into was, like I said, same thing as what happened in England, essentially. Potentially, if this is an explanation for it, that the wealthier would try to find ways to root out or get rid of some of those undesirables that either were near their property or just were a pain to them for some reason. So that's one thing that's been considered. The other thing is actually it would have been a fungus that would have caused some problems. And that sounds strange, but this ergot fungus, what would happen is rye was the main cash crop and main source of food, and it would go into other things that they would eat and or drink. So what they found by going through some of the records of that time frame was that during that same crop or that same time period, there had been reports of crops who had this fungus that was growing on them. And I'll show you a picture. I'll move my picture here, but this is what it looks like. So this is a regular um, rye. This part through here, but then this growth that you see, that's actually the fungus that's growing uh, in and on the rye itself. And what the interesting part is, I find it really interesting, is that when you look at the side effects of this fungus and consuming it and getting it in your body, are things like paranoia, hallucinations. Uh, there's some people that have seizures and things like that, but nonetheless, they would have all these symptoms that would feed into the whole notion of witchcraft of, oh, I saw someone doing something, or I saw in essence they're hallucinating about what they see. They saw an aura around someone, or someone was acting strange. So yeah, those are all things that ironically are very similar to the side effects you would have from LSD. So it's kind of like saying they were on a 6-month LSD trip or a pseudo LSD trip by consuming this fungus. So that's probably at least part of the explanation, in addition to both things combined, my guess. So moving on from that, the one thing I want to talk about, but I'm going to spend more time talking about it in uh, in class when we return next week, is folklore and fairy tales. So before we had a whole lot of written stories, or to be honest, most people, even after we had written stories or documents, there were still a lot of individuals out there who were illiterate. So even if there were books, a lot of the poor or disadvantaged could not read them. So a lot of the ideas, the ideologies, stories, or things, life lessons they needed to pass on, they passed on verbally through stories and folklore, fairy tales. So if you ever hear of say Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, you have um, Hansel and Gretel. Those are some of the more popular fairy tales that people hear about. If you've ever heard about the uh, Grimm brothers, or Brothers Grimm, if you want to say it another way, uh, and those two brothers didn't write all of them. They didn't compose and come up with all of those stories. Some of them, yes, they did writing their original thoughts and ideas. But some of them were just taking the ideas and the stories, folklore that had been passed on through years and years. They just basically wrote those down. Uh, and so if you think about Disney's, fairy tales as we call them, a lot of them are this, pristine uh, idea of what happens, very, I guess you would say, child friendly, or overly fluffy. But reality says, like in these folklores, they would actually, these stories had legit reasons to talk about things to do or not to do as far as behavior, what's accepted, what's not, dangers that you might face. So a lot of those stories were actually pretty. I'd use the word grim because it's kind of where we get it from. But if you want to say gritty or darker, so I don't. I can go into it when we get in person. But excuse me, Red Riding Hood is actually a lot more gruesome than the version that a lot of kids may read or hear when they're younger. So, um, but the main concept behind that is there's a threat outside, such as a really basic concept of Red Riding Hood was back in those times there were cities, villages did not have prisons per se. So what they would do is if they had someone who committed a crime they deemed worthy of what you and I would want to imprison someone, they banished them or cast them out of the city walls, and they were to live in the woods. Say like um, a lot of places, say in Germany, where some of these stories are more popular. Uh, they had the Black Forest. What they would do is send them out there. And when the idea behind Red Riding Hood was it's telling kids to be careful when you go outside the walls because there are wolves, or in essence, there are criminals out there that want to harm you. Because we think about wolves as being out in the woods. Um, they are dangerous. They typically hunt in packs. So that's kind of how the criminals were. Once they got thrown out of the city, they would kind of work together, see people along pathways, rob them, kill them sometimes, whatever the case was. So that's basically the story of Red Riding Hood, what they're trying to get across. Be careful of the threat beyond the walls of the city or village. So um, let's move on to another topic entirely, this crime data collection sources. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to, instead of going into every single option, I'm going to kind of touch base on some of the different things I think are important to know. For instance, when I talk about the Uniform Crime Report, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, the basics of it, but I'm not going to go into great detail about it because it will, or is in the process of being taken over or phased out by another source. Or database, if probably be a better word. But the two that I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about, like the Uniform Crime Report, would be first, and then we'll talk about National Incident-Based Reporting System, also called NIBRS. And so, as far as the Uniform Crime Report, or UCR, it's collected by the FBI. Both of them are actually. But a lot of these come from 1,700 different, or excuse me, 17,000 law enforcement agencies. And something I think you would need to know, besides the fact you can read there about creating or generating crime trends, here's some different things about it. So UCR collects things, information from police departments, but here's kind of starting from the beginning side of it. First of all, someone has to call the police, okay? And from that, an arrest would have had to have been made. Right? And then the third part about that is that arrest would have had to have been reported to the FBI from the agency. And the only thing that you really know about the incident is you know what crime was committed. And obviously, since it was an arrest reported, you don't have to worry about whether there was an arrest or not. That was a crime that was reported to police, right? So, and there's no other details to it. It's just here's the crime, here's where it was committed. But it doesn't generate any more information other than location and type of offense. So that's where there's a big limitation, or has been for years with UCR. And there's been other databases, different ways, different surveys, for example, that people have taken. But what you're seeing is, like I said, there are going to be some changes we'll talk about when we get to NIBRs of really what information or evidence they're collecting. So, yeah, we'll talk about that here shortly. But the one thing I do want to talk about, I definitely want to talk about this in person also, but we talk about crime mapping, how it's used, what exactly it is. Like I said, I want to spend time with that in classroom because you can see it, we talk about it a little bit better. But as far as UCR, there's only one other thing I really want to talk about. There's part 1 and part 2 offenses. I do want you to know that. I want you to know what UCR is, some of its weaknesses, some of its strengths. But part 1 and part 2 offenses, as you can read up here, part 1 offenses are crimes against person. Part 2 is crimes against property. So with crimes against person, you'd have simple things. I say simple, but things that you would normally come up with, like murder, rape, sexual assault. You'd have battery, for example. Okay. But then for part 2 offenses, those are property crimes, and they may be considered arson, burglary, theft, vehicular theft. Those are all examples. But when it comes to violent crime index that came from, it to be called something different in the future. But violent crime index comes from the UCR, which is composed of just this part 1 stuff, crimes against persons. But nonetheless, understanding what UCR is, like I said, and understanding what part 1 and part 2 offenses are. Okay, persons for part 1 and property for part 2. Okay, I'm going to skip over that because I already talked about it. But crime mapping, Toronto crime map, that was one of the first cities that really did a good job of actually doing the crime mapping, showing what crimes took place where. It kept track of dates, but it wasn't as real time as what you see now. Like for example, Toronto, it's updated, but the one here that I had looked at was probably from about 3 years ago. But now you have different departments. There's Harborfront, which is in essence a part of or next to San Diego. There are other cities out there that are using, in essence, you and I will call it predictive policing. And what they do is they take the same thing that UCR does, except they do it a lot faster. So they find information about crimes that have been reported, arrests that have been made, but it could just be crimes that are reported. They see where they're happening, they see what crimes are happening, where they're happening, time of day they're happening, and then what they can do is they can put that into the database that goes directly to those officers that are out there working, and they can look at, pull it up on a map and see where the crime is being committed, what types of crime. And the predictive aspect of it is, okay, what can we do? We know what crimes are being committed. What do we need to do as far as our personnel? Where can we put them, or how can we distribute our resources better to stop that crime? So it's much closer to real time, like within 4, sometimes 8, say 4 hours of the incident occurring, it will be uploaded to that map that all the officers can see. So that part is definitely good, but I want to spend more time talking about where that can lead us down the road, good or bad. So some different crimes that can be reported. Sorry, I'm checking my time here because I want to make sure I keep within the realm. I am going to have to stop it a little bit ahead of when I wanted to, but I just need to make sure I get it in time because I'm only able to do it in like 15-minute segments right now. So either way, the one thing I want to kind of finish up on is, which I already alluded to, NIBRs. The reason why we want to go with NIBRs in lieu of the UCR is because you have some crimes, for example, that are not reported. 60% of all crimes are not reported, for example. And some examples of crimes that don't get reported would be like, okay, someone hires a prostitute and gets robbed in the process by someone else while they're supposed to be doing their transaction. Isn't going to report that because it's embarrassing. Plus, it's would offend their families. But also organized crime. If you got a kilo of coke or whatever stolen from you, you're not going to go report to the police. Same thing with sexual assault. Some people aren't real sure about, don't think they'll be believed, or aren't sure about really what happens if they don't report it, good or bad. So I'll pause there, and then I'll be back just to make sure we cover the last part of this historical context and also get into some more information as far as NIBRs.